What's up everybody, it's Charles. Today we're going to be fixing a bushing in the steering column on the R32. Alright, so this bushing actually gave the last little bit of life while I was ripping the R32 on the tail of the Dragon. I was cruising along, felt something hit my foot, couldn't figure out where it went. When I stopped, I actually found these pieces laying on the floorboard. My first thought was actually it was something in the seat, but the seat seemed to be okay. And there was a little bit of play in the steering column, so I dropped the lower kick panel and found the rest of the bushing. This is actually the first time I've ever seen one of these completely fail on a Mark IV, so you are in for a treat as far as the repair goes. So we're gonna go ahead and replace this hard plastic bushing that actually lives at the top of the steering column. It is available separately. It was like 30 bucks or so. Spent a couple more dollars and got the bolt that goes through it. And of course, as always, I'll put links to everything we used today down in the description. All right, we're gonna start by removing the cover at the bottom of the driver's side dash. This is held in with 3 T20 screws, one on the left, one in the middle, and one on the right. Once that's done, we can pull this lower cover off, and here you can see all of the bushing pieces from that bushing that came apart. Next, what I want to do is remove this lower section here. This is going to free up quite a bit more room for us to work. First thing we'll do, we'll remove this side cover where the fuses are. A lot of this plastic is super fragile, so be really careful. You can see mine's all broken up, so be careful with this stuff. This one's barely attached, so it pretty much falls off. There are 2 tabs right here, so you actually have to kind of lift it up and away. There normally lives a screw right here, but this piece on my car is broken, so it's not there. Slide that piece forward and out. You can see this is all broken too. Next, we're gonna go ahead and take this metal piece off. This is a series of T20 and T25 Torx. It's pretty easy to tell where they go and where they came from, but if you need to, go ahead and mark them to remember where they go when you're putting it back together. All right, now that we have that cover off, we can zoom way in and see that bushing that's all come apart. You can see a little bit of it dangling right there. That's the bushing that we're going to be replacing. Next, we are going to work our way to removing the steering wheel. First, we're going to take the upper steering column trim off. You need a small Phillips head screwdriver and go right up through the hole at the bottom. There's one on the passenger side as well. Next, we're going to take this trim off, pull it back towards the back of the vehicle. Now we lift this trim up and out of the way. Now we're going to remove the airbag first. Before you take the airbag off, we want to make sure the steering wheel starts straight with the wheels straight as well. Disconnect your vehicle battery. Then what we're going to do is we're going to turn the wheel 90 degrees either left or right. I always do towards the right first. I like to use this bent screwdriver that I made for many years of taking airbags out. You can also use a small flat blade screwdriver or a pocket screwdriver. At the back of the steering wheel is a tiny hole. We need to take our screwdriver through that hole and push the spring down to release the airbag. Next, we're going to rotate the steering wheel 180 degrees from where it was or 90 degrees from center and do the same thing with our screwdriver. Before I take the airbag off, I like to turn it back to wheel straight. You could take it off here, it doesn't really matter. Undo your connector. And then when we take our airbag and we set it on the ground, we want to set it facing up like this. That way, if for some reason it explodes this way. If you do it this way, it's going to launch the airbag, which they launch about 2 stories in the air. It's actually kind of cool, but you don't want that to happen to your airbag. Next, we want to reach in and disconnect our airbag connector. If it gives you any trouble, you can take a pocket screwdriver right on the side, barely twist it, and then it'll release. We're going to take our number 12 right in the center and then break it loose. Normally I'm sitting in the driver's seat doing this, and I kind of support the steering wheel with my knees. This is torqued to about 50 Newton meters, so it's probably on there pretty tight. That one came off pretty easy. Make sure whatever you're using is long enough so that your ratchet doesn't hit the steering wheel and scratch it. See, it's kind of a goofy looking bolt here, so should be pretty easy to remember where this goes. Now, most of the time, there's a little mark on the steering wheel and on the steering column to help you get it lined up right. If you're not 100% sure there's a mark or something looks a little sketchy, go ahead and put another mark on it to make sure you get this lined up correctly. If you don't, your steering wheel is going to be off-centered. Take something like a paint pen and just put a mark on it. Now what we can do, just take our steering wheel off. Next, we'll take the 2 small Phillips head screws out of the front of this lower steering column trim. On the bottom, there are 3 T25s that we need to remove, 2 for the rubber pad for the release handle, and 1 that holds the column trim on. Then we need to drop the adjuster down and slide the steering column trim off. Before we go too much further and start disconnecting all this stuff, I'm going to take some masking tape and tape our clock springs so it doesn't get all wonky and out of place. They're usually pretty good about staying where they belong, but this is just one more level of safety to make sure that we don't have this get all out of time. Next, what we are going to do is just go ahead and disconnect all of our electrical connectors. Sometimes a pocket screwdriver helps. Take a good look at your connector for your ignition switch. We'll have to get that fixed at some point soon. Pay special attention to this tiny connector right here for the immobilizer coil. This is one that a lot of people forget to connect, and then your car won't start when you get it all back together. All right, we got all the electrical connectors disconnected, including our SAD ignition switch connector. We got one more thing we need to undo, and it's the ground connection at the bottom of the steering column, right behind the ignition switch housing, right here. Check and make sure this is good and clean. Drop it in your tray, and then pull this eyelet off. All right, next we need to cut these 2 zip ties here holding the wiring harness on. All right, next we need to remove this little cover in order to get access to the lower part of the steering column. Oftentimes you can just loosen these little screws by hand, but if you need to, use a flat blade screwdriver. Just be gentle so that you don't mar them up. All right, next we need to disconnect our steering column from our steering rack down here at the bottom. Now normally, when you have the wheels straight ahead, the bolt down here at the bottom is facing out so that you can actually get to the head to it. So we're gonna actually have to rotate the steering wheel a little bit in order to gain access to the head of that bolt. So we can take our tape off, which didn't stick very well anyway. Get our steering wheel, go ahead and put it on, and we're gonna rotate it just enough to where we can get to the head of that bolt. Looks like about 90 degrees ought to cover it. Once it's turned to the side, I'm gonna lock the steering column so that it doesn't move around on us. Take our steering wheel off. Now we can get access to that bolt down at the bottom and remove it. Once you take that 13mm bolt out, you can try and pull up on that little coupler down here. Sometimes that works, sometimes it needs a little pry bar persuasion. And this is keyed, so it should only go on one way. You can see this channel right here where the bolt goes. All right, we have a couple more bolts to remove. We have the bolts that hold the steering column on right here and one on the other side. Then we have the bolt that goes through our bushing. It is pretty well buried way back at the back, just above the clutch switch on manual transmission cars. The bolt head on the driver's side here is a 13mm, and the nut on the passenger side is going to be a 10mm. This is what our bushing looks like. It's installed in the car basically like this. Through this hole is a shear bolt, which means we're gonna have to take the column out to get the shear bolt out, and we'll replace it with a regular non-shear bolt because, well, I don't really like shear bolts, and hopefully we never have to mess with this again, but that's what it's got. So we're gonna have to get a 13 on this side, which is gonna be over here, and then a 10mm on this side, which is gonna be more towards the passenger side. All right, next we need to remove the 13mm that hold the column on. I like to loosen one, then break the other one loose so that you're not fighting a loose steering column. Now you're gonna wanna support this when you take the other bolt all the way out. Once our steering column is all loose, we can take it, slowly pull it out of the car. And you can see right there is where our bushing was, and there's the shear bolt that we have to get out. So there's any number of ways that you can remove this shear bolt. Pick your favorite method. I'm going to use a Dremel here, cut a channel in the center, and then use a flat blade screwdriver to just twist it out. After getting the bolt out, you'll notice there's some blue Loctite on it. So whatever we put back in, we need to make sure we Loctite it up. Now, before we put our new bushing in, I'm going to clean all this stuff out. So I'll just take a rag and some brake cleaner and get any bits of the old bushing out. And there's like this goo in here. We're going to get all that junk out of there. Here is our new bushing. Here is, well, what's left of our old bushing. And what we're going to do, we're just going to slide this in. I got my new bolt. This is not a shear bolt, of course. That's what came out of it. Shear bolt like this. It's probably best if you go ahead and use a new shear bolt. I don't have one, so we're just going to use this one. The thread pitch is 6-on-1, and it feels like it's probably about, I don't know, 25 millimeters, give or take. Put some Loctite on her. They actually don't list a torque spec because the torque spec is when the little piece of the shear bolt breaks off. That's properly torqued. If I had to guess, you're probably looking 10, 15 newton meters, give or take. We're just going to go ahead and snug it down. Now that's in. This is a new bolt and nut for the bushing. We'll use those when we install it. That's pretty much it. Now it's time to get the steering column back in the car and get it all back together. Once you have the bolts for the steering column started, go ahead and line up the bushing that we just installed. Having the steering column loose will make it a little bit easier. We're going to put our bolt in from the driver's side to the passenger side, snug it down, and then torque it to 10 newton meters. Okay, now that we have our steering column attached to our steering rack, I'm going to take the bolt and I'm going to put it in and just start it by hand. Now I'm not going to torque this bolt down just yet. As you can see, the space is a little tight there. Once we rotate the steering wheel a little bit, it'll make it much easier to torque that bolt down. All right, now that our steering column's all bolted up, let's go ahead and plug our connectors in. All right, we're going to do the same thing on the passenger side, get the 3 connectors hooked up. Of course, don't forget to get your lock cylinder reader coil plugged in. We'll go ahead and attach the ground strap at the bottom of the column. Go ahead and zip tie our wiring harness back up. Go ahead and flush cut those. All right, now we can take our tape off of our clock spring. Go ahead and turn the steering wheel straight just to really make myself feel better about it. Take our steering wheel back off. Next, let's get our lower steering column trim on. We need to put the donut for the ignition switch in. That sits in there like that. You can see there's a notch at the top that corresponds to this notch right here. This just slides in the groove. Mine's actually broken, shockingly, a little bit. So we're gonna just have to nurse that in there. That's about what it should look like. We need to drop the steering column adjustment release. Notice there's a big channel right here. You need to slip that through the handle, slide it up. Make sure on this side you get that rubber grommet over the ignition switch. Tuck your wires in, and it may take a little massaging, but eventually it'll go into place. These short Phillips heads are the screws that go from the front side of the cover. Next, I like to do the top cover, and I like to do that before I put the steering wheel on. It just makes it a little easier. We want to drop the steering column to its lowest position. That's going to make installing this upper cover a bit easier. When we install this on the back side, it has to hook into the lower cover. So when we install it, we're going to install it down and then clip it at the front. Pay close attention to your gaps where the 2 cover pieces meet. There should be a very minimal gap there. The screws that go up from the bottom are the longer black ones. Clip our trim cover at the top in to the instrument cluster. Next, go ahead and put the T25 at the bottom of the steering column trim in, and then the 2 screws that hold the little rubber handle for our steering column adjustment. Let's put on the steering wheel. We want to make sure that our marks line up, either the one we made or the one that was there. Focus on the one that we made. You can see if you get it 1 spline off, it actually looks pretty close. That's pretty far off there. That's close. That looks like exactly where it should be. Looks like both the factory mark at the top and the one we made lined up perfectly. Plug our airbag connector in, get our fastener that holds the steering wheel on, start that, make sure to get any wires out of the way. We don't want to pinch that. The torque spec on this bolt is 55 Newton meters. Now, there's actually something kind of special about this bolt that holds the steering wheel on. It's reusable up to 5 times. So every time you take it out and then put it back in, you're supposed to make a punch on it so that you know how many times it's been removed and installed. After it has 1 or so marks on it, maybe 2, I would just go ahead and replace it. It's cheap insurance for a pretty important part of your car. Next, we will install our airbag. We'll go ahead and plug it in. That just snaps on. The airbag clips in here and here into the steering wheel. So what we want to do is we want to set it in, line it up, and then I like to just apply even pressure on both sides and snap it into place. Now that we have the steering wheel installed, let's go ahead and tighten down and torque this bolt at the connection between the steering column and the steering rack. This bolt gets torqued to 30 Newton meters. All right, while we're down here, let's go ahead and put this cover back on that we took off earlier. Next, let's go ahead and put the metal support back in with the T20s and T25 torque screws. We'll go ahead and put our lower cover on, put our lower dash trim on, install the side cover that covers up the fuse panel, and finally, let's get all these old bushing pieces off the floor. There we go. We got all the parts installed. A couple of things we need to do. If you disconnected the battery, go ahead and hook that back up now. Make sure that you don't have any lights on or anything like that. Make sure your car starts and you didn't forget to plug in that reader coil connector. Check and make sure your steering wheel is not floppity. It looks like we did a pretty good job of getting rid of that floppiness in this steering wheel, so we're good there. Now we want to take it on a test drive, make sure we don't need to reset our steering angle sensor or anything like that. All right, guys, I'm going to wrap it up there. Questions, comments, drop them down below. If you like the video, hit that thumbs up button. Don't forget to subscribe. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll talk to you again next time.